This has been so exciting also because as the Small Book for Big Platform, the first two volumes are right now in an open peer review process. And I would love to see if some of the conversations that we've had today would also feed into the responses that we will get from different members of the network towards the books that we are sending out. So let me begin by talking very briefly about something that I think a lot of you are familiar with because you were present when we were launching the entire project. That the Small Books for Big Platforms is a part of the Platform Futures project, and it's a comparative cross-country study that explores the potentials and perils of data ecosystems and platform ecologies for countries in Asia and Australia. The books kind of revolve both around the question of friction, so trying to look at things that just quite don't fit, like things that we know don't yet know how it's going to end, but we also know that it's not going to end necessarily well. And they revolve around understanding the platforms as a nuanced entity. The platform in both these volumes is not a monolith, but it encompasses a multiplicity of practices. And in fact, they look different and have different histories in different parts of the world. For the second volume in this series, we particularly focus on mobile ecosystems, and 3 of the 4 contributors are joining me today to take us through some of the highlights of their work. And it's my pleasure as one of the editors of the series to briefly contextualize how these pieces work amongst themselves. So I have to confess that the contributors have taken up an heroic task because they were charged with giving us a lot of details in very little word space. And it's been fascinating to see how an ambitious overview has emerged to look at the landscape of mobile penetration and access and what are the kinds of opportunities and challenges for the future. For me, the contributions are particularly interesting because while mobile internet and data are leapfrogged technologies, each one of the contributions shows the contested, fragmented, and material histories of these mobile platforms. The 3 contributions for this book are focused on Singapore, Japan, and it's written from Australia, are now anchored in the truism that we just have to accept that because it is a problem now does not mean that it's a new problem. And I briefly introduce the 3 pieces. So Carol Soon from Singapore takes us through the very treacherous terrain of online falsehoods, cutting through some of the most challenging debates in Asia around encryption, monitoring, surveillance, profiling, misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, but also, as has already been indicated in the panel conversation, ideas around surveillance, ideas around what kind of platforms from WhatsApp to Signal to Telegram are going to be used and how. Carol particularly looks at the policy landscapes in Singapore, and she examines how the hyper-personalization enabled by individually marked mobile devices and platforms of communication that collect massive amounts of data can easily become weaponized in targeting non-conforming and dissident bodies, collectives, and communities. Carol's contribution also reminds us that while closed-loop social media networks have become proliferation grounds for the spreading of online falsehood, for many communities, there are also actually ways by which information is being verified and testimonies are being created against dominant or public domain harmful information. Rowan Wilken and Julian Thomas, who write from Australia, orient us towards the hyper-global instead of the hyper-personal. They focus on Google Earth as a platform and guide us through the complex, often opaque layers of the planetary GeoWeb and how it imagines a digital globe. They unravel the technological, computational, and geopolitical layers that stack up in the making of a platform like Google Earth to show how it leads to contestations of sovereignty and power. So both with Rowan and Julian's piece, it's a very stark reminder that the ways of framing the local and the global, the national and the transnational, and the policies and regulations around these have to be recast to engage in what they are calling a new kind of platform politics, right? One which looks at the fallacy of borders and the absolute shrinking of the world in a platform. And the third contribution in the small book is by Gerard Goggin, focusing on what might be called the ground zero of mobile application geographies, which is Japan. Gerard's piece begins by quoting Mark Steinberg, reminding us that Japan's mobile internet project was actually the blueprint for the dominant mobile platforms of iPhones and Androids, as well as the contemporary capitalist forms of accumulation. This particular contribution focuses on the Japanese technology giant SoftBank, which has been hugely invested in developing comprehensive digital platform networks. And Gerard seeks to establish platforms as embedded in financial and data extraction policies as spaces that need more transparency about their investment in digital futures and the role that they play in shaping policy and regulation. Each of the contributions in this book expands upon the mobile ecosystem in the face of platformization by producing a clear set of touchstones. The ecosystem needs to be studied as embodied, as affective, as material, as political, and as a part of the economic commons. They remind us that they're not merely apps on devices, but are the scaffolding upon which our lives are being built. And having said that, I'm going to give the spotlight to two of the contributors who are with us on this call. The others we will be communicating with separately later. I'd like to begin by inviting Gerard to just give us some of the highlights, some of the insights, take about 5 to 7 minutes to take us through the book to see what are the kinds of new knowledges and insights that are emerging and what are also the best practices that we would like to give to people engaging with mobile ecosystems. Gerard, we are all yours.
Thank you so much, Nishant. Thank you, Malavika and all. It's just been fascinating already tonight to hear some of the comments. So I thought maybe before I kicked off, I mean, I might just talk briefly about some of the things that I had in mind and now will have in mind in kind of thinking about mobile ecosystems in particular, to it all kind of have some observations around the diversity of Asian kind of mobile ecosystems. I think one of the things I'm interested in, I think is really significant, is this integration of the mobile ecosystems, particularly with digital platforms, right, in the last 3 to 5 years. So I've been particularly interested in what's been called super apps, the ways these are brought together. The other thing I thought particularly that I think, Asian Pacific region kind of brings to the fore is some ways the regionality of global media in this area. There's different innovation systems, but I think particularly in Asia, the presence of 4 major countries with sort of scale in technology, innovation and capital. There's others as well, but I'm thinking of, most recently perhaps of India and China, but also the somewhat longer histories in the mobile area of Japan and Korea, right? And then some of the features of the market are quite different. If you think in the App Store, for instance, China is an example of a place that has, its own significant app stores and app stores ecologies. I think that's really quite different. I think one of the other features in the Asian region is the strong inter-Asian flows and dynamics in mobile ecosystems in the region. I mean, that's, across the world in different ways, but I think in many ways there's sort of insufficient attention paid to these. So I'm kind of interested in this. One of the other things I think that comes to this region, and Helene made this point much better than I will, is that, the kind of assumptions we might have about, particularly if with sort of governments are sort of urging us to use smartphones and apps to log in during COVID and to do contact tracing, is that actually the user base is very variegated and differentiated, right? People have feature phones. Many people have feature phones and many people don't have phones at all. And Helene, I thought, gave that to us very, very nicely in terms of the texture. Just a couple more things. I mean, I think there's considerable local innovation that happens around these systems in different countries, and that we don't know a lot about this. There's some focus in particular countries about mobile ecosystems. I think, again, in the big, the kind of capital intensive, larger countries in Asia, but there's a whole bunch of countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, where I'm currently located, where that's not there. And we don't know about these innovation systems and how this works. Okay, so in the contribution to the book, I was really intrigued to be able to to come back and to think a little bit about platform futures from, in some ways, starting from those histories in Japan that Nishant mentioned, the sense in which, you know, there was a time, I think, when Japan was kind of up in lights in some ways in relation to other countries in terms of having, you know, gotten onto mobile internet, you know, earlier. There's some complexities to that. It's about the history of computerization in the internet in Japan and some of the kind of discontinuities in that. And colleagues in the internet histories area have done some really interesting work about that. But I think you could see that sense in which in the late 90s and 2000s, Japan developed a number of technologies, might have been the camera phone, for instance, things like QR codes that have come back. But also I think this sort of ecosystems around mobile content that then became, you know, had a long shadow in some ways for the next 20 years. So what I draw on in this piece is in some ways to build on the work of Mark Steinberg's great book on platform economy in Japan and in East Asia, and to try then to look at the case of SoftBank and the rise of the super app. So SoftBank is really interesting. It's established by Masayoshi Son in 1981 in Japan, so a son of a Japanese, citizens of Korean descent. He's a student at Berkeley, makes a fair bit of money from inventing a pocket translator, which he sold to Sharp Corporation. He returns back to Japan and becomes a wholesaler of software and publisher and so on. So fast forward, puts in different investments in emerging areas of internet systems, particularly, I think, broadband internet. He's a pioneer, that SoftBank's a pioneer in Japan, and also famously holding an early stake in Alibaba. So I suppose one of the things that in recent times SoftBank has really been engaged in is backing particularly the app Lion, which is, you know, really important in a Japan and in a Korean context as a really interesting integrated messaging app. So sort of having a range of sort of services. And so in some ways I take up the story then and to look at the kind of corporate moves around that and the complexity of these and some of the opacity of these when Lion gets rebadged. And it involves particularly SoftBank's affiliates and one of their holding companies and also Yahoo Japan. And I think you have a set of things going on at this kind of level, perhaps the political economy, right? And the organization of this, that also is kind of has feedback loops and sort of different lines that go into the aspects from the ground up, I suppose, from the people using the service. And I think Lion comes particularly into the frame with the terrible Japanese tragedies in the 11.3 Japanese earthquake, right? That Lion becomes a particular way of users, you know, getting solidarity, sharing content in this. And Lion picks this up in their recent infrastructures as well. They characterize their approach as culturalization, that rather than having a globally standardized service, they're trying to do things at a more local level. Which are, you know, interesting sort of corporate and not, you know, unprecedented corporate kind of publicity. So I think one of the interesting things about SoftBank is this sense in which, particularly through things like the Vision Fund, which was involved in WeWork, you know, the kind of work sharing space that then came crashing down and is trying to resurrect itself, having different kind of investments in the air, but a set of them are actually in a bunch of countries and a bunch of companies in Southeast Asia, particularly the one that operates in Singapore and Malaysia, which is Grab. And Grab at the moment is the subject of a massive listing via one of the so-called the SPACs and trying to raise money through that kind of vehicle. And I think, and sponsored by, you know, it's a sort of valued at US 40 billion and sponsored by Silicon Valley venture capital firm Alti Capital. So I think there's a really interesting set of frictions, which we've already talked about, fairly massive ones about, you know, what's the relationship between these kind of large questions of the corporate maneuvers and also some of the opacity in which these are in. Grab itself as a company has very kind of murky corporate vehicles and holdings as well. A number of companies in the digital platforms area do, and it's been remarked on in the literature and so on. And so they can be hard to get at. Yet on the ground, they're playing an important role. So companies like Grab, that SoftBank's investing in, and trying to gain some presence in the Southeast Asian region and some profitability, some revenue, has been really crucial during the pandemic, particularly for the ride-hailing services, which brought it to prominence, for food delivery, and particularly for payment services. And I think this aspect of the money, the new phase of mobile money that many people have written about, and it's really crucial. And then I suppose the moves into the financial and banking sector. So there's been this long observed financialization of capital. But I think what you have going on here is a set of things now with particularly the bigger companies such as SoftBank, and going on with the super apps is trying to make inroads into this area. And I think this is really kind of interesting and important. And the work of Adrian Athik and colleagues in the Indian context was remarked on before. And I think the concept of Adrian's about digital transactions, right? The sense in which you have this wide scale reworking of everyday cultures and practices across different contexts in the Asian region that's going on. And different entities across different countries. SoftBank is one particularly because part of the maneuver with Line, the most recent structure, was bringing together the different payment systems around mobiles and also around other platforms, internet platforms that was bringing together. This provides new affordances and possibilities and services for people, right? Might be in the informal economy, or to get around those barriers that we heard earlier in the discussion. I think Helani again was saying that being able to send money if you're a small producer trying to take advantage of these platforms to reach or to sell products and services. And again, during the COVID period, we've seen this rush to digitalization, the push of governments to say, now we're really doing digitalization, because if you're doing a food stall, if you're doing a market, you need contactless payment. And also here's the opportunity to get the services, and the ticket gets clicked along the way. So I think there's a set of things going on that really seem to be quite divergent around the super app vision, and then the myriads of ways in which it comes to use. And so I suppose that's what I'm intrigued to think about now, to see that in the Japanese context, for instance, you can see that SoftBank has engaged in issues around competition policy and consumer protection, right? Engaged in Japanese responses to Japanese legislation about transparency and fairness in trading on specified digital platforms. But I think in other ways, this just really, there is so much more to be done here. And one of the conspicuous features around this seems to be that some areas where some regulation would be good is actually in some ways old-fashioned consumer protection policy. And that one of the things going on with fintech is that it's just, it's like patent bargaining in something. They're going through jurisdictions and saying, no, well, we want to hold off the moment. We'd prefer a more sandbox approach to regulation. And that's some of the rhetoric is around sandboxing, right? And I think that's popped up in Singapore. It's popped up in other places as well. And I think that says sense probably in a Japanese context. No, the market's too new. We can't have regulation. We have these great services. That's certainly a point. But I think some of this things from a corporate policy perspective, but also from policy and regulation, is pretty straightforward in terms of people having some ability to have some basic kind of as consumers, as users, and as citizens, but also small organizations. So I hope that gives a flavor of it, and I'm really intrigued to hear the other contributions in this section, in this book.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gerard. I must say it was an absolute revelation while I was going through your contribution, not only because there is this great kind of interdependency. It's almost like you are uncovering for us the model of a trickster, the platform as a trickster. Almost as if, taking up from Wendy Chun's point that the more our devices and platforms become transparent, the more they also become opaque. Like it's no longer just one thing that can be pinned down. And it, in fact, does resonate really well with the piece that Julian and Rowan have been working with. And Rowan, can I invite you to talk us through the contribution that you're making and with the particular focuses and what are the key learning points that you would want us to take away from here?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Nishant, and thanks, Malavika and everyone. As Gerard said, it's a completely fascinating event to be part of, and feel very privileged to hear all these contributions. I thought, Nishant, you did an exceptional summary of our piece, and I was tempted just to say we're done here, but I'll try and elaborate a little bit on what we're trying to do in this contribution. So I guess ours is a little bit of an unusual take on the topic that we're invited to contribute on. But we kind of, in thinking about it, we're kind of drawn to talking about Google Earth for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, it's something that's very widely used, but I think at the same time not particularly well understood, particularly by kind of end users of Google Earth, how it's come to be, what kind of goes on to contribute to the imagery that we see, and also some of the sorts of emergent platform politics that we try to sort of point to at the end of our piece. And so we thought it was a kind of an interesting platform to think about, because it's not often thought about in platform terms. Google Earth is not something that we kind of naturally go, that fits the sort of the standard definitions of a platform, but our argument is that it can be quite revealing when we do that. And so, in very simple sense, Google Earth then is a virtual globe, a map, and a geographical information platform. It's been described as the combination of maps and data. And the software combines, distributes, and displays a substantial catalogue of satellite imagery, aerial and street view photography, together with a wide range of other geospatial, terrain, and vector source data. And so in our chapter, we give a kind of a potted sort of overview of how it came to be. But what we are more interested in is thinking through or approaching different ways of thinking about Google Earth. And one of those is, as we say, to approach it as a rich and quite complicated platform. And it's a platform in the sense that assembles huge volumes of licensed and crowdsourced data from an extraordinary array of sources, including Google's own content. It's subject to an internal set of its own rules. It's configurable and adaptable by its users, whether they be individuals or large corporations. It deploys globally influential technical standards, which they have, in some cases, imposed on those that use that particular platform. And it serves many different markets, from education, environmental planning, news media, and so forth. So Google Earth's quite an interesting case in that it combines some of the coordinating, aggregating functions of contemporary digital platforms with the more traditional role of a software development platform in supporting tools and information systems for third parties. And just picking up on a remark that Yong made earlier, where he talked about spheres of consumption and platforms operating as involving competition within ecosystems. One of the things that Julian and I try to think about is how one productive way of thinking about Google Earth is as a platform within a larger array of Google platforms. And when you do that, what we see is that there's many linkages and intersections between Google Maps, for example, and Google Earth, from their shared use of Street View imagery to the Google Earth-like satellite and perspectival visual capabilities of maps. But there's also quite distinct differences between them. I mean, for one, Google Earth is not reliant upon advertising in the same way that Google Maps has come to kind of be formed. Another way in which we think it's productive to approach Google Earth is to think about it as situated within the broader GeoWeb. And by that, we mean kind of the aggregate of web-based services producing, organising and distributing locationally referenced online information. One suggestion is that the emergence of the GeoWeb is significant in that it signals an important transformation in the structures of geographic knowledge, where in the past, for instance, much of that knowledge would have been produced by national agencies, for example, whereas now it's increasingly produced by private corporations and their platforms. And as part of its history, Google has struck, numerous licensing arrangements that have been had quite kind of complicated legacies. Agnieszka Leshinsky, for instance, talks about the case in Canada where one government agency kind of signed an agreement with Google to supply sort of base map data in the exchange for a free license to Google Earth Pro for a certain period of time. When that license expired, then the government agency had to keep buying a license to access what was effectively their own data. So there's this kind of complex situation emerging around the GeoWeb and Google Earth's and Google's place within that. And then there's also kind of locational and geopolitical and national interests are another important kind of way of thinking about Google Earth's evolution, but also its sort of situation within the larger GeoWeb. So what's striking is that many points of friction encountered around the uses of Google Earth arise from tension with nation states and military authorities, and disputes or controversies concerning Google Earth imagery of military or otherwise sensitive locations in India, China, South Korea, Australia, and Taiwan have all arisen in recent years. And in many cases, Google Earth's been willing to resolve these issues by agreeing to display obscured imagery of the locations involved, or at least for users in outside jurisdictions, flagging them as contested areas and locations. So kind of teasing out this idea of Google Earth as a platform in more detail, in the chapter we identify what we see as 4 components of how it operates as a platform. And I won't go over those in detail here, just to sort of flag those for those who have not yet had the chance to read our contribution. So the first of those is data sets. And as I've already alluded to, there's a number of different modes of data collection that Google draws on in order to populate the underlying data. And these include substantial volumes of imagery drawn from partnerships with NASA, National Geographic, and a range of other suppliers, as well as public agencies, as I've already mentioned. There's also aspects of their data as acquired through crowdsourcing. And then finally, they also capture their own data through the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, as well as manned flights for photogrammetric and other uses that feed into what we see as part of the Google Earth kind of data set. The second kind of component is computation, and we kind of flag 3 aspects that we see as important there. The first is the capacity developed by Keyhole to combine and render satellite imagery. The second is the capacity to drape detailed 3-dimensional imagery of buildings and natural features over the globe, providing a level of detail which could be integrated with street view photography and high-resolution satellite imagery as a sort of a triangulation of these different sources of data. And the third is the rendering of 3D features and buildings has also benefited substantially from Google's advances in machine learning. So the third component of how it operates as a platform is the creation and implementation of a standardized format for all its data that gets ingested into Google Earth. And here we're talking primarily around KML, or Keyhole Markup Language. And as I kind of suggested in the example of the Canadian case that Agnieszka Leshinsky talks about, these file formats have formed a critical point of platform leverage for Google Earth in the way in which they both populate and promote and kind of have attempted to commercialize that information. And the fourth crucial component we see is extensible architecture. And what we're meaning here is primarily the incorporation of additional information that overlays the Google Earth imagery through the use of layers in particular, and perhaps the most famous of those being the crisis in Darfur layer that has been much written about, which was developed between 2007 and 2009 by Google Earth and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So where we kind of wrap up the chapter is by thinking about the sort of the paradox that is Google Earth, that here we have what should be an incredibly successful platform that in some ways has not realised that success. And we kind of work through some of the possible explanations for why that's the case, including potentially the complexities of its relationship with the other platforms within Google's ecosystem, principally here Google Maps. And the fact that the most valuable aspect of the Keyhole acquisition was possibly not the digital globe itself, but the technology that enabled various forms of data to be kind of manipulated. There's also, I think, and this is where I'll leave you, the turbulence Google Earth has consistently encountered in its dealings with national governments and military authorities. And I think what we try to suggest is that it's these points of friction that are worthy of further attention. So if the new GeoWeb were taking over some of the critical cartographic work of the states, from the production of maps to their distribution and application, our suggestion is that it should not be surprising then that so much of the friction generated around Google Earth has been about the security and sovereignty of states. Such a transition could never be straightforward, and in this respect, the recent history of Google Earth perhaps points towards a future of increasing geopolitical involvement and in technology, and this is what we mean by a new kind of platform politics. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rowan. So for all the people who are already in this call, I'm just putting the link where the contributions are still available and open for an open review. I know, Siddharth, you already generously spent some time reviewing some of the contributions. I really encourage a lot of you to perhaps come and have a look at one of the contributions. They're small, but they're big. And it would be great to get your feedback there as well. I will also kind of quickly head towards a wrap-up, saying as editors for the series, one of the ways in which we are framing this second volume on mobile ecosystems is particularly by looking through 3 different insights for policy actors to take away with us. By looking at the notions of the emergent, the urgent, and the emergency, right? I think all the 3 contributors are very clearly showing that we need to stop talking about platforms and their contexts as emergent, because there is a political economy which betrays that it's a much longer established practice that might be iterative and updating, but it's pernicious. And perhaps in Carol's piece, it is the most obvious that to keep on talking about these technologies as emergent also shifts the axis of responsibility from these platforms, because they are able to present themselves as nascent and underdeveloped, whereas they in fact have an extremely complex ecosystem which is around them. The second is the notion of the urgent when it comes to mobile ecosystems. And the urgency actually is in thinking through open platforms. That we need an urgent scrutiny that looks at the apps on our mobile phones as surfaces that need to be dug deeper to understand the mechanisms behind it. Something that I think Gerard's piece really brings out in terms of how perhaps it's time to unbox the mobile platform, even as we unbox the mobile devices. And the last one is around questions of emergency. You know, in many of the countries within Asia, and especially within the COVID pandemic, the mobile phone and the mobile platforms have been presented as critical response tools and lifelines in times of emergencies. But perhaps it's necessary to also look at them as implicated in engineering emergencies of certain kinds. But more crucially, when you think about platforms like Google Earth and the kind of cartographic decisions that they make, where is the accountability for these kinds of decisions? Who guides the decision making in times of emergencies and crises? And what are the other larger market drivers which might be softly influencing and pushing these conversations of the policies, regulations, safeties, and protections when it comes to online platforms within mobile ecosystems. So it has been wonderful to look at these first drafts. We are going to get the books ready in three more weeks. By the 30th of June, we are hoping to get the final drafts ready, and then it goes into production. So thank you so much, Carol, Julian, Rowan, and Gerard, for contributing to this, for producing these ambitious overviews of what the futures of mobile ecosystems are going to be. And thank you everyone for this incredibly rich context that you've given us today within which the books need to be located. So appreciate it very much. And I will hand over back to Malavika now.
Thank you so much. This has just been wonderful. I think reading the papers is a treat in itself, but then hearing it filtered through your own lens, Nishant, is also like another layer, which has been really, really instructive. So thank you so much for taking the effort to synthesize and remix and, add value through the way that you've sort of connected and joined the dots between the different papers. So thank you. And I really loved hearing. We can read so much, but hearing people talk about their work is always so much more exciting. So thank you all. And this has just been a wonderful, wonderful event for me personally. And I hope you all got something out of it and learned something new and sort of going back home and incorporating it into your work, which is so valuable. So thanks, and have a good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. And we'll see you soon. Okay, bye.